Hey guys, my name is Kyle. Welcome to another video on using the sequelize ORM in a Node.js project. Let's get started. So in the last video, we finally created a user using our create user route, and we're good to go. In this next video, I want to talk about the beginnings of user authentication. So the beginnings of user authentication are basically where I'm going to create two different services. One service to identify who a user is, and not really two different services, but a second part of services or a second group of services, which will then limit what a user can and cannot do. Okay? And these are going to be middleware, because remember in the diagram, I don't have it up at the moment, but remember in a diagram earlier, I said that we're going to have something that sits between the app.js file and our API gateways, and that's going to happen right here. Whoop, right here, so line 12. It's in the app.js file, but we're going to run everything above this application gateway first, and then it's going to sit right before these application gateways are actually reached. That way it is ran on every single call that can come in to these gateways. And what we want to do is we want to create a piece of middleware which can essentially identify who a user is. Now, remember that we already created a okay, first off, we're talking about a user. So this is definitely going to be a part of the user service. And if we look at user service, so let's look at that first. We don't see anything to actually do this. We do kind of see it with validate user exists, because we are passing a username in here, and it does we are passing a username in here, and it does grab something based on this username. However, we aren't actually, in this particular call, we are requiring both the username and the email. And I want to build something much more generic than this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create something that says, find me this user and give it to me. That's it. And we actually already have that somewhat. If you look in UserDB, we have a function that takes in a username and will then return that user to us, here, or it will return null. So we do have a function which already interacts with the database and finds the user based on their username. The only thing we don't have, however, is a function that finds the user based on their user ID. So when we do eventually move over to Passport and authentication and making sure a user is logged in, we are going to be sending a cookie back to the browser, and that cookie is going to essentially hold the user's user ID. So if we look in our database, that cookie is going to hold this number or sequence of this string. It's not going to hold their username. So we can't really use this to find that person's username, or find that user based on their username. However, we can create a function that is essentially identical, just instead of passing in a username, we pass in a user ID. Or if we did want to, we could actually make this function a little bit more complicated, pass in both a username or a user ID, and then do things based on that. I'm just going to make them two different functions. I don't really want to have to pass in multiple arguments to this at any given time. Okay, so we'll create a function, probably just like right underneath this. You can create it wherever you want. So function, so let's say function for finding a user based on their user ID, args, user ID, and it's a string. And then returns user object. Okay, so this is going to return the user object, and then we'll just place right underneath this, we're going to say async function and find user by ID. User ID. And then let's export this function. All right, so then let's head into our user-DB tests and open this up. Minimize that. Okay, minimize, delete that comment. I don't need it anymore. Minimize that and that. Okay, so it should return a user based on their ID. Now I don't want to actually write this function in the user.db.js file yet. We're going to write it in here. And the reason that we're going to write it in here is because I actually have to create the user. We're going to use this create dummy user function right here, but I have to actually create the user, then write this function, then destroy the user just as before, because I don't want a test user hanging around in our database. So first we're going to say let or const user equals await create dummy user. Create dummy user. Okay, and then right after that we're going to say user await user dot destroy, or actually no, await, because down at the bottom we should have a destroy dummy user. So await destroy dummy user, and we'll pass in the user variable to that. All right, so in between here, let's go through the process of finding said user. So we want to write a function, and it's basically, let's write it down here. Yeah, I guess we could actually write this in the user.db file, because we want to find this user. So first off, we do kind of have in here what I already needed. We wrote here that we're going to check if an email already exists. We return the user. Now let's kind of write out what we expect. I'm not going to write in a comment. I'm just going to write it. So let's say that we had a user const found equals some function. Okay. So then we want to say that expect found dot to be an object, because we're expecting it to be a user object. Okay, then we want to say what the properties are. So expect found dot to have property and permission ID. Okay, and we're creating we're creating a user with permission ID of 1. So we want to say expect found dot permission underscore ID to equal 1. All right, so that's what we expect found to be. And yeah, I don't see a reason why we can't just create this in UserDB. So let's go all the way at the top and let's bring in this. So find user by ID. Go back down here, uncomment this, and we'll say await find user by ID. Now we want to pass in user.id because remember we're creating this user on the fly, so we don't actually know what the user ID is going to be. So we want to just pass in user.id, and that will be that. So now we're expecting it to be an object, that it has a permission, and then let's actually just make sure that this is a user. So I want to test one more thing just to be extra sure that we're getting back the right thing. We'll say expect found dot username to equal test underscore test. Okay. This should test everything. So obviously this is going to fail in a big way. But I don't want to run it yet because if this fails, this won't run. So actually let's just move this above there and then we can test it and watch it fail. So actually what does find user by ID do? It doesn't, so it'll just return. Okay. Yeah, we can test this. Give it a second to actually start. All right, so it says it expected undefined to be an object. Whoop. Obviously it wasn't because find by user is currently doing nothing. So let's write some code and make this work. So we're going to borrow almost all of the code we had from username exists. So let's just copy all of that. Except for the error, I'm going to leave that be. So copy, paste. Except now we're going to find where ID is equal to user ID. Okay, so we're going to find one where ID is equal to user ID, and then if user, return user, otherwise return null. Okay, so now this should work. So if we run it now, everything works. We now have a function which will find a user by their ID. Let's do one last thing. The reason I didn't want to copy the let's actually stop that so that stops happening. The reason that I didn't want to copy the exception or the error throw into that is I wanted to create a separate test for it because, well, it actually, it is something separate from what we're doing here. This is one of the downsides of doing testing like this, is that it does kind of prevent you from copying large pieces of code. You should be testing individual pieces of code, or individual functions of functions, if that makes sense. So we're going to say it should throw an error because show an error when finding a user by ID because no user ID is passed. Okay, async function and ta-ta-ta. So we're going to copy this code right here. Actually, we're just going to copy this code first. So copy this code, and then we're going to create a try catch block. So try and catch. Remember that that user needs to be outside of the try catch block, because inside of the catch block, we're going to write await destroy this dummy user, and then inside of the try block is where we'll actually call findUserById. Okay, now this is what's going to fail because we're not going to pass this in. And we're going to write an error. So in UserDB, let's under here write an error that says if not equal user ID, throw new error invalid argument user ID. And then let's copy this here. We'll go back into our UserDB and we'll say expect e.to be an error and expect e.message to equal that. All right, we'll go ahead and give this a run. And it passed. We're all good to go. All right, so now that we have both of those functions, we now have a function in our UserDB which allows us to find a user by ID. One thing I'm going to clean up, this is just how I prefer to write my code, is, oh, we don't have any private functions in here. Okay, never mind. I don't need to clean anything up. So now that we have a way to find a user by ID, we need to go into the user service. Remember that only the user service can communicate with this UserDB. But again, we're going to do something kind of like we did with create new user, where we're technically just making that UserDB available. So we're just going to write async. Oop, what are you doing? All right, we'll just write async function find user ID okay, return, and let's see here, we want to import this, so find user by ID, so return find user by ID, user ID. Okay, and then let's export this. Find user. Okay, so our user service now has a function called find user. So what we will do is create a piece of middleware, because this isn't going to be a part of any service. And let's call this user identification Yep. Okay. Now, with user identification, because it is a piece of middleware, we're going to just export a single function from it. Obviously, you don't need to do this, but that's what we're going to do. So module.exports equals a function, and that's going to take in, let's see here. Whoop, hold on. So this function is going to take in, well, first off, it's going to return a function. All right, and then we're going to have it take in the normal middleware thing. So rec, res, next. Okay, and then we're going to have it do something. So it's going to, this is the function that is going to determine who a user is. So it's going to reach into this user service. So we're going to need to require in the user service. So let's see here, const user equals require, and then let's go up one into services, users, and user service. All right, so we're going to say for this that so we're going to say for this, let's imagine that each what's the word I'm looking for? Request that comes in is going to have something called rec.user. So this is something that's going to get, let's comment that out. So each request that comes through will have a rec.user if the user is logged in. All right, so if this user is logged in, this rec object here is going to have a rec.user, and we want to pull that off. So let's say if, or let's say const user ID equals, so if rec.user, we will say rec.user, else we'll set the user ID to null. Okay, so this is going to make sure that this is only set to something if the user is logged in to begin with. Now, eventually, we're going to write something that looks like this. If I'm not going to type it out. Okay, so eventually we would write something that looks like if user.is, I think it's is authenticated with Passport, find this user, which is basically saying if this person is logged in, find out who they are. The fact that we have this rec.user is also an indication that they are logged in, but we still want to make sure that they are logged in. And when we will talk about why we still want to make sure they're logged in when we talk about sessions. So we will not just be using cookies to verify users. We don't work like that. But outside of if this person is logged in, we want to say if rec, or not if rec, if user ID, do something, right? Otherwise, just say next. So if they are logged in, if they have a user ID, which means if rec.user exists, then we actually want to do something. Otherwise, just forward it on, keep this moving. So if they are logged in, we want to find this user. So that's where we're going to say user dot find user. And for this, I'm not going to use async. I'm just going to call it. So user underscore ID and say dot then. And this is going to return to us a user. Okay. So one, if user, because we don't want, if this didn't return to us a user, that means for some reason someone has a rec.user, but they are not an actual user in our database, which sounds incredibly fishy. But we still want to make sure that user actually was passed back to us. So if user, then we're just going to do this. rec.user ID, or let's say identity. So no, actually let's say user underscore permission equals, and we'll say user.permission ID. Just like that. So now this request object, which will be passed through all of the other requests, has a permission variable attached to it that is equal to their permission ID. So we now know, based on who this user is logged in as, what they are able to do. Now we can't actually use this just yet. I just wanted to set this up. What we actually have to do next is implement this rec.user. This doesn't exist yet. If I were to try and test this, it would fail horribly. There are just a couple other things that I want to do, but I'm actually going to do those after we do passport, because I don't like the idea of writing function after function after function and then being able to test it. So let's do that next. I will see you in the next video.
You said that you needed me like a cargo